Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Highruler, and today's video is going to be talking about Paul Tassie's latest article in which he talked a little bit about Suicide Squad and the user scores versus the review scores. Now, before we even get into this video, my little disclaimer for anyone who's going to watch and come into my comment section is that generally speaking, I do like the work that Paul Tassie does. I've been a fan of his for years, and I generally think he's spot on with his analysis. On the other side of that, I don't think Suicide Squad is a perfect game that is absolved of all criticism, right? There are some things that the game does well. There are some things that the game doesn't do that great. So, with that being said, let's talk about the article itself. All right, so Paul Tassie's article here is talking about the split between the critics as well as the users that have played the game. And I think it's really interesting because you don't necessarily see a lot of this in the gaming space. You see a lot of this, though, in the movie space, where some movies will score better with the audience than the critics. And you do see that sometimes with the superhero movies, which is really interesting. One of the things that Paul Tassie likes to point out, though, is that when it comes to the verified purchases, the game actually does pretty well. On Steam, it has 82% positive rating over 3.5k reviews. On PlayStation, it is 4.45 out of 5 stars out of 6.3k reviews. And on Xbox, it is 4.5 out of 5 stars with 1,000 reviews. And those are pretty good numbers overall, generally speaking, right? I think a lot of games would be happy with that. Not just with the user scores, but the critic scores as well, right? When it comes to the critic scores, it seems like this game falls in the 6 range for a lot of the critics there. Now, there's a few things that I'll take from this article here, and Paul Tassie touches on the narrative that the media has it against this game. And I generally think the media, from what I've seen outside of a few circumstances, has been pretty fair to Suicide Squad. I think Paul touches on some points that it seems like a lot of critics are over the live service aspect of video games, and I generally would agree with that. I can generally agree with Paul that for the most part, it seems like most review sites have been generally fair to the game. I think obviously you have the case of IGN and what they've been doing, and then there's obviously a case of a reviewer who only played the game for 2 hours and then put it down. But it seems like for the most part, a lot of review sites actually did play through the game, and most maybe didn't like it and rated it at a 6. And I think that's pretty fair. I've always held the stance that if you play the game and you don't like it, then that's fair, right? You gave the game a shot, but your job is to review it. So that's obviously what you're going to do, right? And I think generally speaking, it seems like most review sites have played it, and some have rated it very highly and some haven't rated it that highly whatsoever. So I could see that being the case. And I could basically agree with Paul that live service from the aspect of a lot of reviewers as well as the general gaming community just seems to have poisoned any discourse around video games nowadays. If a game comes out as live service or games as a service, it just seems like right then and there, a lot of people will write it off. And generally speaking, I can see why. A lot of these games come out and they don't really offer a lot, and they don't really do a lot for the people who are playing those games. So it does seem like the bad reputation can carry over to games who are trying to do better, which I would think Suicide Squad does with their monetization. So I would generally agree with Paul on a bunch of those points. So now I think Paul does touch on a couple good points here when it comes to the user side of the game. And he makes a couple good points about you needing a large player base in order to kind of, fund the game and keep the game going. But it's always tough to kind of have that conversation without the full data set, right? So for example, a lot of the time what we'll do is we'll look at the Steam numbers of a particular game and extrapolate that in order to make a trend, right? So for example, if a game is growing on Steam or declining on Steam, the thought process is it's probably being repeated on some other platform. And I could see why people would make that assumption. And I can definitely understand that more often than not, that maybe is the case. But it's hard to kind of get the specifics of the numbers in order to kind of say, yeah, this is definitely happening. For example, a game may be declining 50% of its players over a certain time period, right, on Steam. And you can see that and you can verify it. But for example, on PlayStation or Xbox, maybe it's only 10%. Maybe it's only 5%. Maybe it's only 30%, right? Or maybe it's going in the opposite direction. The point is, it's hard to kind of extrapolate that from one data set and kind of apply that to all sorts of data sets, right? Because we just don't have the full picture. For example, we know that Helldivers 2, the game that is just recently released, has sold about 1 million copies. Now, we can't really tell from Steam and other websites how much it's sold. Steam Spy has it about 200 to 500,000, right? So at best, that's 20% or around 20%. To at best, it's 50 or maybe just a little bit higher than 50, right? And that's totally fair. But that's not the full data. That's not telling the full picture, right? So it can be very hard to kind of get the idea and the understanding of what is happening there. And we may see certain conversations happening around Helldivers too in a month's time where the player numbers are going down, and that's kind of the end of the world, right? And I think it's always going to be one of those conversations when your data set for one particular platform is available versus the other platforms which aren't available. But I think Paul does touch on a point there that you do certainly need a critical user base who is going to fund your game, who is going to buy cosmetics, who is going to kind of be actively involved and engage in the things that you do. He's not wrong there, but when it comes to the specifics and when it comes to the numbers, we just can't speak so definitively on that, right? I think when we see season 1 come out and players return and players buy the game, it's going to be one of those situations where we're going to see articles and YouTube videos about the player numbers are returning, and then the player numbers will go down again, right? But we don't know that across the board. I would even make that same argument that if on Steam next month the game shoots up to 100,000 players, we just don't know that on PlayStation as well. We don't know that on Xbox as well. It goes both ways. I'm just saying, right? But he's not wrong that, yeah, you definitely need players in order to fund the game. And I definitely think that if you don't have players to fund your game's not going to do well. We see this across the board all the time. But I think speaking to that point, what Suicide Squad has done very well is they've definitely targeted the players that they wanted for their game, right? The super hardcore grinders who want the looter shooter, who want that in a superhero skin, right? They really have figured out the kind of players they want, and they've done very well based on the user scores on those 3 platforms. The challenge is, how do you take that and how do you get that word of mouth being spread to some of the other people who may not be so invested in any of those aspects? It really is hard, right? A looter shooter live service definitely turns a lot of people off right then and there, right? With those couple of words. So the question is, how do you actually bring those people in? And sometimes you can, whether that's through the ongoing content and the robustness of that content that's being released. And other times you just can't do it no matter what you can offer those players, right? It's not going to happen, right? So I would agree that yes, Suicide Squad definitely needs a lot of players, and they need ongoing player engagement, and they need players being onboarded at a good amount of time, right? If every new season you can get a great amount of players being onboarded into your game, wonderful. If you can have those returning players come back and spend some money as well, even better. A combination of both, you're golden, right? And I think that's kind of the point he's making. I would just definitely disagree that when it comes to the specifics, it's hard to talk about those specifics. You can talk about on Steam, and I think definitely on Steam, the game has trended downwards. But I would definitely think that when Season 1 launches in March, you're going to see those numbers spike up, right? The question is always going to be, how long will those numbers spike? How long will they be sustained? And what kind of decline will you see, right? Is it going to be a sharp decline of 50% or even higher? Potentially, maybe. Is it going to be a soft decline of maybe 25% or even less? I mean, that's potentially going to happen as well. Season 1 is definitely loaded with what's been leaked so far, and I think there's going to be a lot of reasons to be hyped for Season 1. I think it's definitely going to be one of those things that we're going to have to wait and see how it goes, right? I think a lot of people have put the game down, and I think a lot of people are looking for reasons to pick the game back up, right? I think the end game for the structure of it doesn't really offer a lot of people a lot of things to do right now, right? You have a couple of missions, and it's all about grinding, and it does seem like they've addressed that with the Season 1 and the leaked content that is coming with Season 1, so I'd be interested to see how people are going to perceive what they have now in Season 0 and what they're getting in Season 1, and if that will kind of entice people to stick around longer, for example, right? So, I mean, all in all, I don't think Paul is wrong on a lot of his points here. I think we would argue in the semantics a little bit about using a data set and trying to extrapolate that across all the different platforms, but I think if he's just looking at Steam, I would definitely agree that the game has trended downwards where you don't really necessarily want to see it trend downwards, but I think a lot of that is just kind of the cycle of live service. So, I mean, it's really interesting. I think there's a lot here to talk about, but I also think that at some point, this conversation is going to have to switch gears from the outside perception of Suicide Squad and just kind of talking about what is the game giving us? What are we doing in the game? And I think some people are trying to move that conversation away from the articles, the media, everything about it, and just kind of like, hey, like what builds are you guys using? Hey, like what's broken, what's not broken. I think the community is kind of ready to kind of bridge away from this and into that more nuanced in-game conversation. And I think over time we'll definitely get there. I think with the launch of season 1 and all that new content, I could definitely see the game kind of switching gears and the community switching gears, which will be nice. But it was a good article. I will link it down in the comments below for you guys to read, because I definitely do like the work Paul Tassi does, and I definitely don't disagree on a lot of the points, if really any of the points. And I definitely think you guys should follow him if you don't already. I definitely think when it comes to a lot of the gaming articles and media and the rest of it out there, Paul Tassi is probably the most fair. He definitely gives live service games a shot. And obviously, why I would like for him to like Suicide Squad, he definitely did put the time in. He definitely did actually go through the campaign into the end game and gave it a shot. And I think, honestly, that's really all you can ask for nowadays. So that's all I got for you guys today. Just a quick little video talking about Paul Tassi's article. Once again, down in the description, go read it. Go follow him on Twitter or X or whatever. Go watch his YouTube videos. And I'll see you guys next time here on the channel. As always, enjoy the rest of your day and the night. Take care to hear yourselves. Later, guys.